This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hi and welcome to Thank You Mama. I'm very excited today because we have a very special guest, a guest I was hoping to find since the whole idea of Thank You Mama podcast. My guest is an academic whose work revolves around parenting. Hello, Dr. Charlotte Faircloth.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much.
Welcome. So Charlotte is a social anthropologist, and she's a member of Center for Parenting Culture Studies. Her PhD research was focused on attachment parenting and full-term breastfeeding. And Charlotte is an author of Militant Lactivism and co-author of Parenting Culture Studies and Parenting in Global Perspective. And I almost forgot, you're also a wife and a mother of two.
That's true. Yeah, that takes up a big portion of my time as well. Yeah.
As I can imagine. Do you want to tell me more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently at UCL, which is University College London, in the Social Research Institute. And I suppose, for the last sort of decade or so, my research has been about parenting, as you said, and particularly the kind of shifts in what has been called parenting culture. So I've largely sort of worked in the UK, also a little bit in France and, with colleagues around the world. But to sort of look at the ways in which parenting has become what's been called sort of more intensive in the last generation. So really interested in what's happened to this idea of raising the next generation, that it has become a much more kind of overt activity that people do, that you can have classes in, that you can read about, that there are, parenting experts on the telly, online, and what that sort of does, if you like, to the experience of having children and people's sort of perceptions of themselves as, men and women and as mothers and fathers. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And as you said, I originally did a project around attachment parenting and specifically long-term or full-term breastfeeding. And then more recently, my work has been about couples and how they divide childcare.
Charlotte, what is long-term or full-term breastfeeding?
I suppose, it depends on, your kind of, your take on the whole thing. But I use the expression full-term breastfeeding because that's the expression used by a lot of the parents that I was working with. And that is to indicate this idea that children have a kind of hominid blueprint for breastfeeding, which means that they kind of need breastfeeding until they decide when to stop, sort of based on, other mammals and the historical fossil record, that kind of idea. So it's very much an evolutionary narrative. And for the majority of people I worked with, that was, probably around 2 to 3 to 4 years. In the most extreme case, it was 7 years old. And there were some mothers who were still doing it at a year and a half, but perhaps, and considered it long-term breastfeeding. But the general length, I guess, would be around 2.5 to 3 years.
Charlotte, let's talk about parenting and especially motherhood and how it changed throughout the history, because I read recently Sarah Knott's book, Mother is a Verb. And it's interesting that what really stuck with me was that we've never been as isolated as mothers before.
So I think, I'm not really qualified to talk about, motherhood across the whole of human history. I don't know if anybody is, but certainly I think you can see, as you say, that the way in which parents and particularly women, so therefore mothers, are expected to raise their children is incredibly isolated these days and sort of very much more individualized, I think, than it was in previous generations. And that's partly to do with, late capitalist society and the idea of the nuclear family where we live in separate houses, and certainly in the UK, childcare is very kind of privatized, and it's seen as a kind of second best option to the mother doing it if you employ a nanny or if you use childcare outside of the home. So it's, I think you're right. It's certainly caused, a lot of problems for a lot of women. And it's very hard negotiating the demands of a small baby on your own. And it makes so much more sense, in fact, to share a lot of those responsibilities more collectively. I remember quite distinctly when I was preparing some food, I think, for my son. I was sort of pureeing something, and I sort of had sliced up some, peeled and sliced and boiled some carrots and then mushed it up. And I just thought, God, I could have fed 6 children this evening quite easily. And then every other night of the week, somebody else could have cooked, but as it was, I was sort of doing that, and creating these tiny little ice cubes worth of puree. I mean, it just sort of really brought home the as you say, the isolation and the individualized kind of nature of contemporary parenting, which I think is really, really sad.
It's sad, and it's so recent because until very recently, people still lived in larger communes or communities, and you would have sisters, brothers, nephews, aunts, grandmothers helping. And then, I don't know, I'm guessing with the Industrial Revolution, when we started moving into cities, suddenly it's mom and a child. We have this very new constellation of so many other different influences. We are now working more often this is not correct. Women were always working. Women of privileged classes weren't working. But I'm guessing that more and more women now work, but also more and more women, as we are talking about it, don't have support of a community with a child. And there's a third aspect of this attachment parenting, of a whole, I think, new idea of what parenting is and should be.
So that kind of third element that you're talking about, I guess that's where most of my research has kind of been. And one of the kind of key findings, I guess, from scholars who look at this historical change is that a lot of this can be put down to the kind of popularization of developmental psychology. And so this idea that what happens with babies in their infancy has lifelong implications for their sort of future health and happiness has really kind of intensified expectations around mothering and motherhood. So I think you're right. It's not only that people are sort of doing it in a, post kind of industrialized context and all of the pressures around home and work that introduced, but also this kind of much more psychologically inspired rationale for the idea that, if you are not kind of well attached to your baby and if you are not kind of providing adequate, stimulation and things like that they will then go on to have kind of problems in later life, has created a huge pressure for a lot of parents. And, by that I mean women, because it is very gendered. And I think in much more recent kind of years, not just the kind of psychological rationale around, secure attachment and good development, but this much more neuroscientific language has started to emerge about the importance of early sort of infancy for building babies' brains and developing the correct kind of synaptic formations. And this sort of neuroscientific idea has really entered the popular consciousness about the importance of motherhood. And again, that then places a huge pressure on women who are already quite stretched because, we are working a lot more outside of the home than we used to be. And what you would imagine is that as women work more, that the pressures on motherhood might actually decrease, but actually that's not the case. So Sharon Hayes, who wrote the book, who sort of coined the term intensive mothering, points out that actually those two expectations have kind of risen in parallel, which is why you now have this kind of language of juggling and being torn and everybody being exhausted.
But it's so funny, Charlotte, because I do feel guilty when I complain, because I think of women and how they used to live and mother. And now we feel like we have all the luxuries and we have safe and comfortable lives, but we are so stressed out about being mothers and motherhood. And it's so tiring, I think of my great-grandmother who had 5 children, and the husband left to work in the States, and she was alone with his 5 children, and she took care of her olive grove and went fishing and, took care of her little farm and of these 5 children. And I'm sometimes thinking, how did she survive that? I'm struggling with one with all the luxuries and a washing machine.
Well, yeah, but I think it's not that it wasn't hard, in those days. Of course, parenting has always been hard because children require things from you all of the time, particularly when they're tiny and they're kind of helpless. But I think if you use the example of a mealtime, these days we have to think about it as an important bonding opportunity, as creating a kind of good palate, as a sensory learning opportunity. We don't just think about feeding children. We think about a mealtime as like all of these other things that could potentially lead to problems down the line if it's not done right. And I don't think that that's how people a generation or even two generations ago, like your grandmother, thought about it. So they would go off and leave the baby with a nanny and have a holiday and or they would put the baby, in the nursery in the hospital and get a decent night's sleep after childbirth, and all these kind of things that would now be considered really kind of dangerous almost in terms of like mother-infant bonding or optimal kind of brain development for babies. It's like actually mothers' needs have really been kind of screened out of a lot of these debates, kind of in the interests of the child. But, I also just think that historically mothering just was not such a big deal. You sent the kids out of the house to go and play unsupervised, and that was kind of normal, and that's what everybody did. These days, you'd be considered really reckless probably if you did that, certainly in London or LA or New York or wherever, because we've become a lot less trusting of general society to help us raise the next generation. It's very much on the shoulders of individual mothers and fathers who are accountable for any risks that their children are subject to. So I think it has changed, materially, but also the way we think about these everyday tasks of parenting, like feeding or like sleeping or whatever, that it's not just common sense anymore and you just do what you've got to do. It's kind of got these, much more important ramifications put on it, which of course is really stressful for people. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it was easy for your grandmother to have 5 children, but I do think that it was a very different way of thinking about it.
Exactly, very different. I don't think she played with his children ever. I think women just didn't go down on their knees and play with the way we do it now. I spend hours playing with Kai and teaching him, and that's next to school and my work and everything else, and making dinners for him. So I'm hearing and thinking that actually we should call for a new revolution in motherhood in the name of feminism and saving women's sanity. Let's calm down with motherhood.
Yeah, sign me up. But, it's very hard to push back against this culture, as an individual.
Because you're blackmailed with babies, with children. It's like the trickiest battle to fight, because of course you want the best for your children, but it feels like it's getting more and more expensive for our own sanity and health. And that's also not good.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously tied to a kind of a call to arms for feminism is a kind of conceptualization of children, because I think they have been understood as very kind of fragile and at risk, from bad parenting or the world at large. And actually, I think understanding children is a lot more robust and plastic, able to cope with more adversity than we seem to imagine is a kind of, a big part of it. And I think a concrete thing we could also do is to call for kind of cultural reappraisal of childcare, and how, certainly in the UK, as I was saying earlier, like it's thought of as very much like second best to care by the mother. Actually organised, good quality, well-organised childcare is a really good thing. And that's something that we could kind of mobilise around a bit more.
But I can only speak from my experience with Kai, and of course children are different, but he started preschool when he was 2, and he loved it, maybe because he's an only child. But he just loved going into this group of other kids and being independent, and he blossomed. I couldn't have given him these things. He alone at home with me, it's just, it's impossible. So I am definitely for, as you said, good childcare.
Yeah, and certainly as children get older, I think, it's really important that they socialise outside of adult kind of, not supervision quite, but adult interference. I think it's important that they learn how to do all those things without somebody constantly refereeing. And
Charlotte, I want to go into lessons and learning from our mothers with you. And you wrote to me that a lot of your academic work has been around that, about the role of parenting support and advice. And how much of it is good and how much is it actually intrusive or didactic. I have a feeling from all the interviews that I've been doing now, and it's been maybe even 40 at this stage, it's interesting how unconscious women are about, or parents in general, but what we really teach our children. You know, we are so aware of math and this and that and behaving and blah, blah. But these big life lessons, like what do I really want this child to learn from me about life? We never think about, actually.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah. I suppose, speaking academically again, and I'm obviously very happy to talk more kind of personally as well. One of the things that I've kind of looked at is this rise of like parenting classes, as though parenting is something that you can be taught and you can kind of optimize and excel at by just learning a few more skills. And, that's not to say that parents don't appreciate some advice, like particularly around the practicalities, but I genuinely think that parenting or raising children is a kind of intimate relationship that actually, as soon as you start trying to kind of teach, loses something. So if you think about having wifing classes or cousining workshops, it would just seem really weird, because it's like, well, I don't know, you just do, a lot of it just comes instinctively and will feel appropriate according to sort of different family cultures and settings and all the rest of it. And I do think that sometimes this kind of policy interest in parenting or parenting classes, whatever, really kind of misses the point. So it's not all about kind of, make sure you make eye contact with your child 20 times before breakfast. Actually, parenting is that kind of like, come on, let's get your shoes on. No, don't do it like that. Let's try that, and you can't sort of like, I don't know, put like a skill set necessarily on that, but it's those kind of really small day-to-day interactions that, as you say, gradually build up to become a kind of set of values that you're trying to transmit. And that, I think, is really crucial, and it's really kind of important, I suppose, that as parents, if you are doing it in a couple, that you have a conversation about that with your partner, but also that it feels like a kind of shared social enterprise. And I think that's one of the things that we've really lost in recent years. I think maybe this is slightly rose-tinted, but my sense is that in the past, if a child got on the bus and didn't pay their bus fare, you could rely on another adult who was also on the bus to say, listen, Sonny, it's really important that you pay your bus fare. Yeah. And that would be a social sense of like, what we do as a society is you pay your bus fare when you get on the bus. These days, I don't know that I could guarantee that would be the case. Certainly in London, I think people would be very anxious about getting involved. They might be worried about getting hurt or thought of as kind of some, paedophile. And you might worry that the parent was going to come on and say, why the hell are you talking to my kid like that? And so there's a real breakdown of solidarity around raising kids. So that kind of dynamic in the whole parenting thing is really sad, because you can't any longer kind of connect with other parents just sort of simply on the basis that you're parents. It's really kind of politicized.
Yes.
You can see it in sort of practices as well. If you're a breastfeeder or a bottle feeder, are you somebody who wears your baby or uses your stroller? And all this kind of stuff has become more than just a kind of common sense or easy way to get through the day. It's like, who are you as a person, and where do you stand politically, and don't you kind of come here with your ideas about my kid? And I think it's really sad, and it's really common, I think, in societies where, there's less kind of welfare support for parents. So certainly the States, I think it's really exacerbated compared with like the Nordic countries, where there's a high level of like state support for, childcare, parents, that kind of thing. In the States, you've got this idea that like it's down to parents to really make sure that their kid does all right in life. If they want to get a college place, like you've got to be drilling them, in their flashcards from a really young age, and you've got to be saving up the money, and they've got to work hard, and it's like so hothouse. And there's no wonder that you've got this kind of rise of what's called helicopter parenting, and people unable to kind of step back and let kids work things out for themselves because the stakes are so high. But it's really sad, the whole notion of solidarity between parents is really, really eroded, I think, by this idea about parenting as a really individual endeavor.
Charlotte, let's talk a little bit about your mom, since we are all about our moms and what we learn from them. Tell me a little bit about her. What's her name?
Her name is Carrie Faircloth.
Okay, Carrie.
Or Caroline. And she got married at 21 and had me at age 22. My dad was 10 years older. And My brother is 2.5 years younger than me, and the two of us are still really close. My parents aren't together anymore, but my childhood was a very sort of idyllic, happy one. I grew up in the West Country, in an area of the country called Devon, and in a thatched cottage. We had dogs and cats, and I had a pony that we would sort of borrow from the farmer. And, it was really a lovely kind of childhood. But a very strong kind of motif was that my mum would always say, you didn't come with an instruction manual, which I'm sure is, chimes with all mothers, because the first time you hold your baby, you're like, oh, Jesus, now what, But I think it was particularly the case for my mum because her own mother died when my mum was age 7. And that obviously cast quite a sort of long shadow in the sense that she didn't have a granny to kind of turn to, and there wasn't anybody on hand to kind of help out with childcare. She had some friends, but I was born at home actually on a farmhouse. My dad at that point was working as a milkman, like he was managing the dairy herd on a farm. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really lonely. It was a big cold farmhouse, and she had to drive everywhere to, even get to a shop. There were some friends nearby, but there weren't really, family members. And I think it was really hard. I think she didn't really know what she was doing. I was apparently a baby who cried quite a lot, and I think it was really tough. And so, as I say, that's always been a kind of motif that she didn't really know what she was doing. And, I suppose didn't make it particularly easy for her. I don't know. Not that babies can necessarily be held responsible for that. But, it's quite interesting. Then in later years, she went on to train to be a teacher, and with a specialism in early years. Which I think is probably quite telling, is as I said, I've got 2 children, one who is 4 and one who's just turned 1. And it's quite interesting that a lot of our interactions, she'll often bring her kind of professional knowledge to bear on it, which I find completely irritating. But it's obviously not surprising.
You're like, you're not their teacher, you're their grandmother.
Well, kind of, yeah. And actually, I just much prefer it when she says, oh, well, I just did this with you. And that so for example, she said, oh, God, I can't believe that I sort of smacked you on the bottom once or twice when you and your brother were small, which, of course, these days, and as a parenting kind of, or an early years specialist would probably be considered, absolutely appalling. But it kind of oddly, I sort of prefer it when she's just sort of more, I don't know, just sort of honest and a bit less, uptight's the wrong word, but I suppose because I spend a lot of my academic career kind of critiquing a lot of the logic around early intervention and et cetera, when she then sort of spins it around and puts it onto her relationship with, the grandchildren, I just sort of go, let's just keep it, more kind of, family based. Actually, the dynamic between me and my mum is that she is the kind of naughty one. So she's the youngest of 3 siblings, or there were several sort of batches of children, but the youngest of the sort of first batch. And she's the kind of naughty, reckless, funny, one who's usually got a drink in her hand. She's like, loves a party. And if anything, I was the sort of grown-up one who always felt like I needed to be the one kind of keeping things in control and having to rely on myself. And, so I think, I suppose she did sort of technically teach me resilience, but it was partly kind of because of things, not but for the reasons that you would normally associate with that. But on the other hand, she was very kind of liberal about talking about, sex and sexuality and kind of having fun and the importance of, just have a good time, don't settle down too early and, all that kind of stuff. So actually, I was the one who was a bit more kind of, I suppose, uptight in response to that. I mean, obviously, it's worth saying as well that this changes a huge amount over the course of your life, So, yes. I think when I was younger, it was certainly the case that I was the one who was sort of terribly sensible and, quite goody two-shoes really at school and that kind of thing, in a way that my mum really was not. But then as I've got older and certainly as I've had children, I realised that I've kind of loosened up a fair bit because I think I felt like I had something to prove. And it took having children for me to sort of feel more at peace in terms of my relationship with my mum. Mm-hmm. Because weirdly, like none of my sort of academic achievements or work ever really felt like they kind of ticked the box in that sense. I mean, my mum didn't go to university, as I said, until a lot later on, and did not have the kind of opportunities that I did in terms of education and that kind of thing. And so I think there was always a sense that I should be grateful for all of these chances that she never had. But it was really having children that sort of put us on a more kind of even footing or something, if that makes sense. And so things have changed again since having had children. And I think now we can both be like the fun one. And, you know, it's not like one of us has to be the one that's in control or not. So, yeah, it's just to say that, you know, these things are fluid, I guess, over the life course, and no doubt will change again, you know, as she gets kind of older and as my children grow and develop a more independent relationship with her as well. So I'm quite looking forward to that, actually. I think it'll be quite fun for them to have, you know, a slightly sort of naughty granny in in the background.
Can you think of any lessons that you've learned from her that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, in advance of the podcast, you sort of asked me to think about that a little bit. And I hope this won't sound rude, but I was kind of struggling. And that's not because I haven't learned absolutely loads from my mum. But again, I think because of this idea that, you know, she feels that she was sort of doing it on the hoof quite a lot. Yeah, that it sort of made it a bit more tricky. But actually, and this will sound kind of trite, and it's really not meant to be, but she is the most amazing cook. And I think a lot of her love and care was expressed through food. And that has become a sort of, you know, something that I think has been passed down from her to me. And now obviously I cook for my children. And I think food is such a wonderful kind of lens through which to think about mothering in particular, because it's obviously about nourishment that is essential, but it's also about care and ways of expressing kind of love or joy, you know, or indeed sadness. But certainly kind of food as a really important part of family occasions and celebration is definitely something that I've kind of learned from her and is now part of our sort of family culture. So I'll always be, you know, very grateful for that. She did a kind of cookery course when she was young and is very well versed in the kind of classic French cookery techniques. And is now, you know, like has, you know, cooks recipes from all around the world. But I think those sort of basics have ended up being really key to my kind of repertoire, which sounds a bit bad, but it's genuinely a really helpful thing. And leading on from that, sorry, then I'll be quiet, is actually a knowledge about how to run a household, which I think sounds really retrograde in terms of a kind of feminist orientation towards parenting. But some of my other friends who were raised by very overtly feminist mothers were very much kept away from anything to do with like running the house. So cleaning, cooking, you know, household kind of DIY, finances, all of that was very much kind of pushed into the background. And they were told, you know, you go up to your room and you do your homework, because what really matters is like getting your exams, your, you know, good grades in your exams. And I never had that from my parents. If anything, they were always like, are you sure you want to apply to Cambridge? You know, it's going to be really hard work. I think you need to kind of calm down, just relax, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I was very much kind of aware of all of the labour that goes into running a household. Me and my brother, I should say, which I think is important from a kind of gender perspective. But actually, as I've had children, that has been very, very helpful to not have it land at my feet like a massive shock, as I know it has been for a lot of my sort of friends and colleagues. So yeah, that kind of ability to keep the show on the road whilst also working, I think is stood me in really good stead. I mean, which is not to say the house is immaculate the entire time, but you know, it's helpful. It's certainly helpful. Yeah.
Charlotte, thank you so much.
Oh.
Do you have anything else you'd like to share?
Oh, no, I don't think so. But it's been really nice to talk to you and kind of it certainly made me reflect on, you know, just, well, obviously my kind of work, but also my own sort of personal setup. So thank you. And it's just, yeah, it's a real honour to be asked, and very good luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being my guest.
Okay, take care.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.